So I was watching a documentary. This was about a year ago, talking about the gambling industry and how slot machines work. And so this documentary goes into detail of how slot machines are actually created, the psychology surrounding them, etc. But did you guys know that slot machines are preset with odds? So, that seems pretty obvious, but they get to preset the odds based upon the customer's demand. So, a casino could say, I want you to tune it to where my customers don't really win very often. Or a casino could be like, well, no, I want you to actually bump it up, make it a little bit more likely to win, but not by much. So they can change the percentages of how much, on average a person wins or not. And so this is going on in Australia currently. And it's called, they call it like a Poke machine. Yeah, I know that no, they don't serve out fucking Pokemon or anything, or they don't serve out Pokemains either. But the Aussies they're like lobbying against these casino companies because they realize that it's really fucked up, both, to take money from people, and oftentimes it's like older people. But it's also like they use these fucked up psychological tactics in order to keep people playing. And so the Aussies are like, they're fighting to get them kicked out of pubs and hotels and stuff, and just kind of limit them only to casinos and things. But the whole point of odds and whatnot, and maybe presetting odds, is the fact that what you may think is a preset odd is actually maybe not the case. Maybe what you think a 60-40 is actually isn't the case at all. And one prime example that I'd like to give you is Faker. Faker is the GOAT at doing this. And so oftentimes people think, oh, Faker's so great because, he can outplay you and he can dodge all these ganks and you waste all the resources against him, etc. But no one's actually understood, or rather gone into the idea of why he's put in those positions anyways, or why he's able to get away with so much like that. And people say that Faker can, get away with a whole lot of aggressing against the opponent or doing auto attacks when he shouldn't be able to because the enemy jungler is around, etc. But what he's doing, essentially, not only is he making it to where you think he's not going to make this play because it's a 40-60, but he also tricks you into doing what you think a play is of a 60-40 or a 70-30. And when you do that, that's when he pounces, and that's when he's able to actually take advantage of you because he's manipulated you into thinking that you have better odds than you actually do. So this becomes very important as far as like the psychological game when you're playing against any particular laner at all. So ideal conditions cannot exist. In fact, prime conditions almost always don't exist. You could think of like trying to hit on a girl in a grocery store, and it's like, oh well, prime conditions don't exist. There's people all around, etc. Like I may not be looking my absolute best, whatever. But you have to also too get into the mentality of, well, you're probably gonna fuck this up anyways. And if you don't put in enough reps, then you're probably going to fuck it up because you don't have enough practice. And I think that goes with everything, outside from the whole, picking up women, etc. Perspective. But it's the idea that if you have to have the perfect circumstance, that isn't going to come along very often. And so, like, in all probability, you're actually better off trying to do it in circumstances which are not in your favor because you end up getting all those reps, right? So there was a famous Apto quote that happened, I want to say this was in like 2018, and he's talking after Worlds, and I believe he's talking about Invictus Gaming, and he says, quote, "There is no such thing as aggressive players or defensive players. They're just better players and worse players." And I think this kind of rings true, and it's the idea that a good player is going to be able to see all the plays that he can make, and a bad player or a defensive player, right, is just only going to see a limited number of plays that he can make. Otherwise, he would make those plays. In fact, if he could see them, the aggressive plays, but he can't because he's not able to have the foresight or the knowledge in order to see these different things. And I think this is another way in order to actually develop this idea of the 60-40 and to be able to realize that there is actually a 60-40 on the table. And this is why I think there becomes a lot of handshakes within the LCS. And you could even point to, now the fucking one of the GOATs is Chovy, and how he can essentially get ahead on CS and almost any mid matchup possible. He can get a lead against the enemy mid laner, and he is regarded as the best mid laner in the world right now. And you go back to the idea of handshake mids, which I think is a popularized term from LS, and it's, if you guys don't know, it's essentially a player agreeing to play at a certain way to where they just kind of neutralize. And they say, okay, I'm not going to make any aggressive plays. I'm not going to try and outplay the opponent. And also, too, maybe if the other, enemy mid laner handshakes as well, both of them say, okay, we aren't going to actually do anything that's going to affect the lane. And so, therefore, we're going to play the game of we're going to try and affect all the other lanes. And so I think this idea of not looking for plays or just looking to survive, you can kind of see that with several different players throughout LCS history. You look at Pobelter is probably the famous one, right, where he just kind of chills in lane. He doesn't really get an advantage. He's never looking to play aggressive, and he just tries to do his job in team fights and stuff later on in the game. You think of Froggen. Froggen's probably the most famous example, to where he just chills in lane. He gets a CS. He wants to get a CS lead, and then he'll just wait out until team fights. Bjergsen, he's kind of trending towards that fashion in the fact that he doesn't really go for a lot of these aggressive plays, and he's ends up waiting for the team fights to where, yeah, he can make aggressive plays in the team fights, which is something into which the other mid laners that I mentioned don't really do within team fights. But it's the fact that he still kind of lays down in the laning phase, and that's this sort of complacency. Essentially, you are self-neutralizing. And so when you're self-neutralizing and you say that you want to do this handshake, then the enemy can look to make plays elsewhere on the map. And that also means, too, that all the other lanes that, essentially, if you say that you're going to neutralize the enemy mid laner, say we're talking about mid, well, then that forces the other parts on the map to play aggressive. But if that is the case, then that's a predictable aspect. If I'm looking at you as the enemy, I'm going to say, okay, well, he's clearly just playing to neutralize the lane. Well, then obviously they're going to play aggressive bot lane, or they're going to play aggressive top, right? They have no choice. And so we can expect that easily, and we can coordinate that plan in order to take advantage of that, whether that be through counter ganks, or through lane ganks or whatnot. It's very easy to take advantage of that kind of information. And I think handshakes in general are even less efficient in this meta due to specifically there being more damage in the game. And so I did another video on this as well too recently, talking about the amount of damage within League of Legends and how essentially what it does is it creates this game state later on in the game to where if one person gets caught out, then the game's over, right? Because everyone can do damage. And since everyone can do damage, that means that person gets blown up immediately. And it's not even that the person got caught out. It's maybe a little misstep, like he's too far forward, half a step, and he just gets blown up instantly. And when you have something like that, then that means that you're forsaking the early game. If you're, handshaking a lane, you're forsaking the early game in order to go to that volatile state of what the meta is currently, to where it's basically just a fucking coin flip of who gets slightly out mispositioned, and then everyone presses their buttons as if it were a fucking FPS game and you're just trying to headshot somebody, right? Because they stepped around a corner. So I think Blabber is actually one of the people that I'd like to commend in the style in which he plays, and recognizing that he needs to take certain risks and he needs to sometimes do 50-50s, because his early game aggression and his early game, sometimes coin flips are not that egregious given the grand scheme of things. Because if you look at just the history of play from this player, and everyone says, oh, well, he coin flips on all these scuttle crabs or whatever and then ends up losing the game. It's like, yes, he does do that, but how many times does it come up on heads earlier in the game or in other games or whatnot? Everyone just suddenly forgets that aspect. And I think it's because when you make a coin flip in the early parts of the game, you can still recover and you can still wait for the enemy to make a mistake. So I want to go back to this other idea of what Apto said before in that same video, in fact, in 2018, about laning. And this is a quote: "You can learn macro. It's extremely easy. You just have to listen to a good coach, and that's all. But can coaches teach you how to dominate lane?" And I think this is a really good point, because essentially, yes, a coach can't really teach you how to play the laning phase or how to look for specific things, probably because they don't have that game knowledge. And also, too, if they did have that game knowledge, and maybe even if they had those mechanics, then they would just be playing instead of you, right, as a player. Because, well, if they're better than you at macro and they're better than at you at micro because they realize all these different missteps or plays that you could have made but you didn't make, they would just be playing the game themselves, right? So this is why I think positional coaches are actually a really good idea, because they can get into the nitty-gritty of the micro aspect about a particular player's flaws and maybe how to work on them. And although I believe it to be a very tedious job, which is probably why players don't want to improve on it, or maybe coaches don't want to address it because it would just take up too much fucking time, that's where the positional coach comes in and is able to analyze all these little different nuances and figure out what is, the best optimal way to improve this player at a micro level. So all in all, with this whole 50-50 decision making, or, making a play which has less than ideal odds, I think it counteracts the idea of complacency, because when you're complacent, you're easy to predict, right? That means if you make the same plays and you do the same thing and you try and get through lane phase and you just work through the motions, you become incredibly easier to predict. And if you're easier to predict, well, then that just naturally lowers your chances of winning that lane or winning the game itself or winning the late game, etc. So it's counterproductive to play with a complacent or a predictable play style. And it is the fact that you need to have some risk within your gameplay in order to keep other people on their toes, and also to just develop your own self and your own skill. And when there are very few win conditions left, like say an entire team is losing or whatnot, that's when you can tell NA teams don't even have this concept of the 30-70 in their vocab at all, or just, using, going for a play that is likely not to work, but you kind of have to do it anyways because you're losing the fucking game. You can think of, innately, when wildcard teams, whenever we see them play, they always start out the game with like a 30-70, right? They're always at the disadvantage. And you saw this with Gigabyte Marines back when at Worlds, right, where they did the Nocturne, and they got Nocturne to level 6 by 4 minutes. It's like, yo, that's something that you need to do, right? Like, that's something very impressive. And I think the idea of the coin flip and why it's not so egregious as people think is because, especially, it's more so if it's done early on in the game, is because when you do a coin flip early on in the game and say you fuck it up, you still have a long time for the enemy in order to fuck up for the rest of the game, right? So now, since you did the offensive attack and they defended it very well, and they hit you back in the face, it's like, okay, well, now you need to get your bearings and wait for them to make a mistake. And so as long as you do your mistake early on enough, then you're able to recoup, and then you're able to see if that enemy makes a mistake. And more often than not, they probably will make a mistake. And also, too, this is self-evident, I think, because when you just look at how League of Legends works anyways, and the fact of respawn timers as well, you get punished more heavily for doing coin flips or doing mistakes at the very end of the game just because of respawn timers. So the game inherently punishes you for doing these risky plays later on. So you might as well do them early when your death timer is low, and it's way more forgiving. And we've seen multiple teams or multiple players like get first blooded, and then that team ends up losing the fucking game. We've all had those games in solo queue where you end up invading the enemy jungle and you get 2 kills, and then suddenly it just doesn't end up mattering halfway in the game because you guys had fucked up at some point and let them take back that advantage. So I think in all reality, coin flip players get too much of a bad rap, and it's not it's not really if you do the coin flip or not, it's how you do the coin flip and when you do it. That's the important part.